by discussing just how you do the adding up of individual supply into an industry supply, which is going to be quite mechanical, except for the fact that entry of new firms can create kinks and discontinuities in the aggregate supply, and we'll talk about how that can be smoothed out by the introduction of uncertainty. We'll then talk about sort of the long run and free entry as well as barriers to entry. And in particular, we'll emphasize how some firms are able to earn a profit, gain a rent, by being more efficient than other firms are. And we'll contrast sort of the textbook analysis of how in the long run the entry of new firms eliminates profits, except when there are barriers of entry, to a perspective that I'm going to emphasize, which is going to be the importance of differences between different producers, that some are more efficient than others, and how that generates rents, because some people have basically greater talents than other people do. And that only for a very narrowly construed type of an industry is it going to be very easy to enter and do just as well as someone who's already in the industry. And we'll try to quantify that by using some empirical regularities, namely Zipf's law, which is a very elegant regularity about the distribution of firms' abilities. And this will set the stage for a lot of the things we're going to study later in the course. So, to derive an industry supply from an individual firm supply is pretty simple. Basically, all you do is you add up all of the supply curves horizontally. And in some sense, this is what you could have done on your problem set. That was one option. You could have taken all the marginal cost curves and added them up horizontally to get the total cost curve. That's one way to do cost minimization when they have different technologies. And that is the industry supply, S bar of P, is just the sum of the individual firm supplies. And this is particularly simple when all firms enter the market at a price of 0. That is, the minimum price at which all firms are willing to produce is 0. But in that case, the industry supply is just the sum of the inverse of the marginal cost curves. And we can then get sort of a industry marginal cost curve, which is the inverse of the industry supply curve. So here's an example of that. If here are a bunch of firm supply curves, these all come out of Cobb Douglas, we can just add them up horizontally and get this industry supply curve. Yeah?
Is there any significance to the individual inverse marginal cost or inverse supply? Like, why?
That'll tell you what an individual firm is going to produce. And that'll help you derive the profits that an individual firm earns, which we'll do in a couple of minutes.
Is that related to like when we did the inverse of the cost function?
Exactly. Yeah. So we had the marginal cost function. We did the inverse of that. We got the supply function. Then we add those up to get the industry supply. Yeah. Okay. So the nice thing, the reason that this picture was so nice and simple, right, is that all the firms entered the market at a price of 0. That is, they started producing something even when the price was 0. But many firms, of course, have fixed costs, as we've been emphasizing for the last 2 lectures, and would not enter at a price of 0. They might require a higher price. And if they, when the price gets up to the price where they're willing to enter at a quantity of 0, that is, that as, if the price is 5, they'll produce 0 units. If the price is 5.1, they'll produce, some very small number of units and then gradually increase from there. Then all that this does is create kinks. So to give an example of that, imagine here are some firm supply functions. This firm enters at 0. This firm enters at a small amount, but enters continuously. This firm enters at a high price, but again enters continuously. Well, then you get an industry supply function which adds these up, which is continuous, but it has these kinks at the point at which different firms enter. However, if firms enter at a positive quantity, then there are discontinuities. So imagine that here's one firm that enters at this price, and it enters at a positive quantity. This firm enters at this price, again enters at a positive quantity. This firm enters at this price, enters at a very large quantity. Then you get this industry supply function, which is basically has a bunch of discontinuities in it. Because when one of these firms enters, the industry supply increases by a discontinuous amount. Okay, so this can be annoying because it makes it so that we can't use calculus. It also is annoying because imagine that you had a demand curve that cut through this industry supply function at this point, right? Well, the industry would never supply something in between here. So it's not really clear that you could have an equilibrium in that case. Or what would happen. So in practice, this problem is not nearly as bad as it appears. One of the most important reasons is that sort of uncertainty about the points at which the firm enters can smooth things out. So firms may have entry points, but we usually don't know for certain at exactly what price they would enter the market, right? So we might think that the firm at some point is going to enter, but they might enter at a price of 5, they might enter at a price of 6, they might enter somewhere in between. And when this is the case, we can just think of the relevant quantity not being the supply, but the average supply to the market. And once we do that, everything sort of gets blurred out, and there's no longer these discontinuities. The average supply is much more continuous than is the supply. And that's exactly what happened in that Afi and Nikiforov data that we looked at, when you had all these different, you were competing with all these different people who were offering different prices to get a spot on the ranking on the Google page. If you were uncertain about what their bids were going to be because you submitted a price and over the course of the 2 weeks people could be bidding all sorts of different things, that made you have this much smoother cost of bidding. The second thing is that these discontinuities have to be small if any given firm is a small part of the market, right? So in the real world, it is the case that there are some firms which really are quite large and can create a large discontinuity. But to the extent that this is the case, it's not really appropriate to use the sort of competitive price-taking model that we've been using. So an example of that is that, imagine we were in this case where there was this one firm that created this big discontinuity. And imagine that demand went through this gap. Then what do you think that the firm would do if it knew that demand was cutting through here and that it was making this big difference in causing there not to be an equilibrium in the market? What do you think that firm would do?
I think it would have to lower its prices so that they could hit the demand function, right? Because they'd sell more.
Well, or, I mean...
Like a shift their supply curve left, right? Or down.
Yeah, so they would lower their quantities, right?
Oh, they lower their quantity.
Right? If they lower their quantity, that raises the price. And then the price is high enough so that they're willing to supply this smaller quantity, and they earn more profits on it, right? So the point is that this actually doesn't really cause a problem once we take into account the fact that if a firm is so big that it has this big impact on whether there's a market equilibrium or not, it'll have an incentive to reduce its quantity, like a monopolist, as we'll study in a few lectures, to make sure that the market clears. So a lot of the times when you get something weird, like there's no equilibrium because it's cutting through, what it's indicating to you is not that you don't know what the heck's going on, but rather that you've got the wrong model. And that once you take into account the fact that the firm can have this big impact, you'll realize that they'll want to reduce their quantity in order to try to raise the price. So basically, to the extent that we're going to assume price taking, it's also pretty reasonable to assume away these types of big discontinuities, because anytime those arise, the firms aren't going to have an incentive to act as price takers. And we'll return to this actually both in a few minutes and on the lecture on Thursday. Okay, so in all of these pictures, the firms were earning some positive profits or rents. So a natural question is what determines the size of these? From the earlier analysis we did, it's the area to the left of the supply curve, right? The more the firm is producing, the more rent it earns, and the wider range of prices at which it would be willing to produce, the more rent it earns, right? Because if it's willing to produce at a wide range of prices, then its supply curve is going to be in, and there's going to be more area between it and the y-axis, right? And that means that the more efficient is the firm for the average unit that it produces relative to the marginal unit, the more profits the firm will earn. So if the firm can produce the average unit very cheaply, but the marginal unit not so cheaply, and that's equal to the price, then the firm is going to earn a lot of profits, right? But of course, the price in the market is determined not just by the firm, but by the set of all the firms in the industry, by the industry supply function, right? And so the key is going to be how efficient are you relative to everybody else's marginal cost. If on average you can produce things efficiently compared to the marginal cost of everybody at the margin, which determines the price, you're going to be earning a lot of profits. So the key is how much better are you than other people, effectively, right? And so this means that there are basically two sources of rents under competition. One is that basically you are able to produce inframarginal units much more efficiently than your marginal unit, and second, that you're better than other people are, right? And so one thing this indicates, right, is that you're always going to produce where your marginal cost is equal to the price. And you're going to earn a lot of profits if your average cost is much lower than that. So what that says is that people who are earning a lot of profits are also people whose marginal cost is much, much higher than their average cost. That is, that effectively they're operating at a point where they're much less productive than they are on average. So this is basically the reason why all things that are doing really well are also really stressed out. So if you think about it, a doctor who is much better than other doctors is going to be in incredibly high demand. Everyone's going to want him to be helping them out, and he's going to be operating at the point where his marginal cost has gotten all the way down to where it's equal to the price, right? So his marginal productivity is way lower than his average productivity is. Whereas people who aren't so good, right, their marginal productivity is already pretty close on average to the level of the market, therefore they earn very little profits. So it shouldn't be at all surprising, in fact it comes directly out of the theory, that the most productive people are also going to be the people who are going to be most stressed out. Because it necessarily has to be the case that they be driven to the point where their marginal productivity is equal to the marginal productivity of everybody else, right? And this is the reason why the best restaurants are constantly packed, and why talented people are constantly turning down offers to do lots of things, why they're in very high demand and have to, turn away so many people who are interested in them. So the notion that accomplished people are stressed is just an implication of competitive theory. Okay, so one natural question is, if there's someone who's earning a lot of profits, but their average cost below their marginal cost, shouldn't this attract competitors to enter the market? And this is a very classical idea in economics, is that in the long run, if people can enter the market freely, firms shouldn't earn any profits, because any profits would attract competitors to enter the market. The idea is that only the short-term advantages, only if prices are only rising for a short term and therefore people don't have time to get into the market, someone will be able to earn a profit. In the long term, they won't be able to. So an example of this was the California gold rush, right? So the first people who found gold in California and a couple people who were like living near California made a bunch of money. But quickly, everybody rushed into the state, and most of the people who came, even a year in, didn't do any better than they would have done staying on the East Coast, right? Because it was very easy to come to California, and they eroded all the profits. Another example of that is, Groupon got into the market for doing their thing early, but a ton of people copied them almost immediately, right? And if one firm is doing something more efficiently than other firms will just switch to doing it the way that firm was doing. So think about Apple. All the smartphones before Apple were these stinky BlackBerry type things, right? And then Apple brought in this touchscreen technology, and within a year, like 95% of all smartphones were using touchscreen technology, right? And on the other hand, anytime a firm is making a loss, anytime it's not doing a very good job, it should exit the market. Now, there was an article in The Onion that I really enjoyed, which said that a fundamental challenge to this classical economic theory was the continued existence of edible arrangements. I don't know if anyone has ever had the joy of receiving an edible arrangement, but they're about the most pointless thing on earth, because the fruit, do people know what this is actually? They're like these flowers made out of fruit. And the fruit is of terrible quality, right? Because it has to be carved up to make this crappy arrangement. It doesn't look like, it's like the stupidest thing ever, right? So the idea was, it did an interview with a whole bunch of economists saying that it was a fundamental challenge to the notion that a firm that's underperforming has to exit the market, that edible arrangements continues to exist. Which I kind of agree with. Actually, if you want to go see edible arrangements and you haven't, there's one at 51st and the train tracks, basically, and Harper. So this theory would imply that the long-run supply function of the industry should be just flat at the minimum of the average cost curve. That's the cheapest way that you can produce, and the long-run supply should just be that everybody produces at that price. And the average cost curve here is defined over all possible technologies that could exist. Okay, so, and Chan Yoon? Why is the industry cost not quite fully flat, even in the long run?
Because in the long run, the number of funds entering the industry will get smaller.
Yeah. So why would that make it not quite flat?
Because not much fun. Being that there's not much fun to enter the industry, will mean that they will not effectively lower the price down.
Yeah, so one way you can think about it is, okay, so if you've got this average cost curve, that as we usually draw it looks maybe like that, right? The minimum point is here. But if there's a small number of firms, if one more firm enters, it would bring you all the way to this point here. So if you get a little bit above to here, it's not like you would do better by going all the way over to here, right? Because then you would be below the optimal point. So the industry will sort of seesaw. It'll get up to that point, and then it'll jump back down to this point, and then go down here. So if there's a small number of firms, you'll be sort of seesawing between being below the efficient scale and being above the efficient scale. And so you'll never be at exactly the efficient scale. Now, as there get to be more and more firms, at a per firm level, you can get closer and closer to this level. And as there get to be a ton of firms, things will be exactly at this average, bottom of the average marginal cost, bottom of the average long-term cost. Now, as the number of firms gets larger, we get very close to this, and this shows you a picture of this. So when there's only a small number of firms, you have to get quite large before the next firm can enter the industry. But as there get to be more, it gets flatter and flatter because each firm is only producing a small part of the total industry quantity. And so in order to grow to the point where the next firm can enter, they don't need to go that far above the minimum of the average cost curve. However, if there's a small number of firms, and so this is a major problem, then the price-taking assumption that is the basis of all this is not very realistic. So this problem, which is sometimes called the integer problem, is mostly going to be a problem if we have an oligopoly or a monopoly. It's not going to be a big problem in the case when firms are competitive. So this is the picture from very end. As we start to get more and more firms, it gets flatter and flatter, and we get closer and closer to this long run, approximate long run supply curve under free entry. Okay. Now, the process of competition can be inhibited by barriers to entry. And these can either be good barriers to entry, or they can be bad barriers to entry. Some of the bad barriers to entry are often government intervention or private violence. And Alexandra, could you give me some examples of these types of barriers to entry?
Just like resources, like.
Well, these are things coming from government intervention or from private violence. If you can explain what's on the slides,
Okay.
you can look at the slides.
So like licensed occupations.
Yeah.
Like I don't know like what else to say about it. I mean like taxi licenses are licenses are like super expensive.
Yeah.
Even though it's just a piece of paper.
Yeah. So the government can make it illegal for people to come in by having licensure requirements. That's right. That's a good example. Doctors, other licensed occupations. Another thing is like there may be all sorts of regulations you need to comply with or forms you need to fill out in order to get into an industry. A classic example is that in Mexico, the cartels basically kill anyone who tries to distribute drugs, right? So that's another way you can keep people out of an industry. And the mafia does that in a lot of industries. Another thing that can happen is that, if a black person comes into a white neighborhood, especially during the 1950s, and opens a store, they can get harassed by a lot of people, or the mafia can, or the Ku Klux Klan can come and harass them. And this might seem like something in the past, but actually a lot of Asian people have trouble opening stores in poor neighborhoods because they get harassed by residents of different ethnicities who don't want them owning stores in the neighborhood. Contractual arrangements by dominant firms can also help keep other people out of the industry. So in Peru, I was working with the government on a case where there's basically one company that controls 98% of the market for beer in Peru. And what they did is they went to all of the posts on the beach that sell beer, and they made agreements with them that either they could sell their beer or they could sell a beer from another company, but they couldn't sell both. So basically that made it impossible for any foreign company to come in and sell beer on the beach, and given that about 40% of the beer market in Peru is on the beach, it made it very hard for anyone else to come into the country, especially given that people associate the beer that they drink on the beach with a good time. And so they don't want to drink the beer back in the city when they can't get that same beer on the beach, right? So a lot of these barriers are created by lobbying or violence. And economists call these activities rent-seeking because they try to create a rent or a profit for the firm by keeping other firms out of the industry. And we view these as bad from a social perspective for basically 3 reasons. So, Tejas, could you give us some of the reasons why these might be harmful?
Why lobbying would be harmful?
Or why it's harmful to, why these barriers to entry are harmful?
Well, it decreases competition. So
Yep.
firms that might have the ability to get into the industry are prevented.
Yeah, that's one important reason, yeah.
Another reason,
That's good enough, that's good enough, that's cool.
just like why it's bad to seek work, that you're asking.
Yeah.
Primarily it would be competition, but then
Yeah, no. So that's a good reason, but another reason is that the money spent lobbying and like the people killed in the violence are like social waste, right? So if you have the possibility of doing this, then people are going to spend money trying to get it, and that's going to be a waste of money, right? And another reason is that the groups that end up getting, rent this way are not necessarily the people you want to redistribute resources to necessarily. They might just be very wealthy people or people who are just unscrupulous, and you wouldn't want them to be getting money and to be taken away from other people. So, while the second two, while the reduction of competition and the redistribution are bad, in some ways the worst of all is the money that's spent on the violence and on lobbying expenses. And the way to see that is that intellectual property creates both of the second two types of inequality, right? It redistributes money to people who are not necessarily the poorest people, and it reduces competition, but we still have it because it encourages really beneficial things, right? IP, patents, copyrights, trademarks, all prevent people from competing because without them, it would be really easy to drive profits to zero. So, and in that case, it would be really hard for companies to make back the costs of inventing something new. We'll talk a lot about this in lecture 13, but the key point here is that what makes an entry barrier good or bad is what it encourages. What sort of activity does it encourage? So, on the one hand, a case where entry barriers are clearly bad are like the Mexican drug cartels, right? Because them being able to keep people out of the industry encourages them to do all sorts of violence, and that's obviously bad for Mexico. On the other hand, the fact that not everyone can be Gary Becker is probably a good thing, because that encourages Gary Becker to come up with really interesting ideas that are important to society. Similarly, it's really, a lot of people really value having authentic things, authentic Louis Vuitton bags, authentic Oakley glasses, even if they can get the same things in imitation on the street corner, or having authentic art, right, rather than just a copy, even if the copy can't really be told apart. And that's really valuable because otherwise, the artists couldn't make any money off of being artists, right? On the other hand, we have patents for drugs that help people stay alive for a couple of extra months at the end of their life at enormous expense and usually in a lot of suffering. And it's not so clear that those are that socially beneficial. So they do benefit people as they keep them alive a little bit longer, but they're enormously expensive and they're basically bankrupting the country. And it's not clear they improve people's lives very much because they basically are at the very end of life where people are suffering a lot and it just prolongs that suffering. So a proposal that I've made, maybe partly in jest but partly not, is that the government should come out and say, look, people have a right to earn profits on stuff like Viagra or on stuff that helps people early on in life. But if you're at the end of your life and this is the only thing that can keep you alive, nobody has a right to earn a profit on that. So everything should be enabled at that point in life. And that sounds very populist, right? Everybody, it's a human right to just have that freely available. Now the true effect of that would not just be that. It would be to completely reduce any incentive that anyone would have to develop those things, and therefore reduce the cost that society has to spend on providing all of the new things, and reduce the growth of healthcare costs. Basically the point is, free entry in that case can help get rid of the wasteful expenditures on developing all of these. Yeah, Tejas.
Something putting authentic art,
Yeah.
how is that a barrier? Could be like anyone. Or is it just like a talent perspective?
Well, I think it is. I think it's a barrier because anyone could get into the business of producing Andy Warhol, but Andy Warhol can keep them out of that just because he says, "I'm Andy Warhol, and this is a real Andy Warhol," right? So that's his trademark, right? So regardless of whether barriers to entry are good or whether they're bad, they're clearly sort of unnatural. They come from some sort of a social norm or a government intervention or something like that. And the traditional argument is that in the absence of these unnatural barriers to entry, basically entry will eliminate all profits. And this is probably like one of the most classical, deepest economic ideas. It shows up in Adam Smith. You learn it in all of your courses. And I think there's some cases where it's quite useful and in fact correct, like in the intellectual property context. So in Peru, I always use Peru as an example, you can basically buy an iPod that's not made by Apple. And it's exactly the same as an iPod, except that it doesn't link up very well with iTunes and whatever. But other than that, it's exactly the same as an iPod. But because there's basically like crap patent protection in Peru. So there's some Taiwanese company that makes like an iPod and like sends it to Peru, and they sell it for $25 rather than $200, and that's what everybody uses, right? And so that like really undermines Apple's ability to design any product for the Peruvian market, and therefore that actually really hurts Peru because there are very few products available in Peru because it's so easy to imitate their products. Now, but the number of cases where it's really possible to do something like this is much more limited. So, and the rest of the lecture I'm going to cover limits to this type of free entry. The basic problem is it often requires talent to produce a product. So it may be true that any idiot or any moderately intelligent Taiwanese person can go out and reverse engineer and come up with another iPod. But that's probably not true in other cases. So I don't think you can just completely freely go out and become Steve Jobs, right? You may be able to reverse engineer his little iPod, but you probably can't reverse engineer what it takes to be him, right? And you probably also, just by watching LeBron James, can't yourself become LeBron James, right? So because talent like Steve Jobs and LeBron James's is scarce, it commands a rent. It allows them to make some profit. It's a barrier to entry, but it's not like it comes out of any sort of a social norm or a government policy or private violence. It just comes out of the fact that different people have different amounts of talent. So free entry, in the usual way that economists use it, requires not just that the government not be messing around, but that everybody have the same amount of talent. And that's not very realistic. So a key factor in whether it's possible just to imitate and whether talent is important or not is how one defines an industry. So if one defines an industry very narrowly, just like touchscreen smartphones, well, it's pretty easy for anyone to create a touchscreen smartphone. I mean, it requires some technical knowledge, but not a lot. Most people who have some reasonable training in computer science can do that. But the thing is that Apple, as a company, is really not touchscreen smartphones. Apple is the company that's always doing the next thing and redefining what the technology industry is about. So when the touchscreen smartphones got not so profitable, the Apple brought in the tablet computer. And now everyone's saying, oh, well, the iPhone 4S, not so great. Well, probably Apple's going to bring out the next thing that's going to completely define the technology industry, right? So it's often easy to imitate narrowly defined things, but it may not be that easy to imitate Apple's ability to be the next technological engine. It's not. You can't really just freely enter the industry of being Steve Jobs, right? So Nokia is a perfect example of someone that wasn't like Apple, right? They were doing some very narrowly defined technical thing, like making these cheap little cell phones at the cheapest way anyone could do it. And it was pretty easy for other people to imitate them, and Nokia is now basically on the verge of bankruptcy. American car companies found out the same thing. Building a car, just a standard car, is something that a lot of people can do. And in fact, the Japanese could do it a lot better than they could do it. And so the American car companies have basically been on the verge of bankruptcy ever since or have repeatedly gone through bankruptcy since the 80s. And the legacy air carrier has found out the same thing. It was very easy for JetBlue and other people to come in and do what they did better. But if you think about broader industries, especially in high technology, these are often defined by the introduction of new products, rather than by just doing the same old thing better. So David King? Yeah. Can you give some examples of industries which are defined by the introduction of new products?
Well, I guess several Silicon Valley companies.
Yeah.
So companies in the business of producing new computer chips.
That's a perfect example.
IBM, other high-end technology sectors like superconductors, maybe.
Absolutely. So, there's this famous law called Moore's Law, which says that the speed of processor chips doubles every 18 months. So, being in the industry of producing chips is not in the industry of producing the chips that exist right now. It's about constantly jumping ahead of the other person in terms of what chips you're able to produce. So that whole industry is defined by getting ahead and not by just doing the old thing better. Google is defined by what's the latest Google service? I don't even know. I mean, every month there's 7 new things on that little thing at the top of Google that says all the things that they do, right? So that industry is defined by bringing out Google Earth, bringing out Google this, bringing out Google Life, etc. Right? Microsoft similarly is constantly doing new things. They're now in the cloud. They're now doing new services on their old process. They're not just making Microsoft Word a little bit cheaper. They're just defining what the next generation of software is going to be. And the truth is, it may be possible to imitate one particular Microsoft product or one particular Apple product, but it's very hard to imitate the process of generating new products that these companies have set up. The reason is that building an engine for innovation like this requires an inspirational leader, a very talented staff. It basically requires being Steve Jobs, not just doing one thing that Steve Jobs did. Okay, so even if we think about a narrow industry, though, it's true, prices will come down over time if there's an increase in demand. But this doesn't always happen by new people coming into the industry and competing down profits, or by a large number of firms being there. Sometimes it can happen by the few people who are at the top of the industry figuring out a way to reach even more people. This, even though it does lead to lower prices and a more elastic demand curve in the long term, it can often lead to higher profits for the people at the top and unemployment for everybody else, rather than to lower profits for the people at the top. So, Navtesh Singh? No, Navtesh. Okay. Does anyone else have an example of a case like this where the adjustment happened? Yeah. What's your name again?
My name's Matt.
Matt.
I'm thinking of like sports, especially where there's like that pyramid scheme where the top people can earn a lot of money, or like even the best, 0.001% are professionals, and the rest are just aspiring. Things like actors and stuff.
Yeah, that's a great example. Another one is like the music industry. So like the music industry in the 20th century really took off in like the 50s and 60s with like a lot of popular music, and that was because of the baby boom. There was like a lot of young people to listen to the music, but the way that happened was not that like there was many more musicians. In fact, there became many less musicians in the 1950s than there were before when the demand increased, because there got to be all these ways that they could reach more and more people. That the development of sort of modern pop culture really happened during that period, and that made a few people able to reach many more people over the radio, over television, in big concerts and so forth. Professional sports is another example that developed over the 20th century. When there was a lot of demand for sports, it was actually that the top people were able to reach more people, rather than there being many more teams or many more sports. Similarly, fast food revolution happened during the similar period. So what happened was not that there was like more and more burger stands. It was that McDonald's and Burger King colonized the whole world, right? This has happened in gourmet food as well, right? So celebrity chefs, like Rick Bayless in Chicago, have set up these big empires. And yes, there has been some entry of competitors, but they've also gotten bigger. So it's not clear that actually their profits have gone down because of competition, given the demand for gourmet foods. Actually, they figured out a way to supply a larger market. And what happens often is the big restaurants just grow again until the point where they're no longer very good. Mass production of design during the 1950s is another example of this. Rather than the big designers facing, like Mies van der Rohe and Michael Graves, facing lots of competition, they figured out ways to mass produce their stuff and to bring it to Walmart and so forth. And you might think that this is actually what's going to happen in the future of medicine and education. It may not be that as the demand for education and the demand for medicine rise, that there's going to be a lot more teachers and a lot more doctors. It might actually be that people find a way through technology to let one teacher reach a lot of people. And that might actually reduce the number of educators and raise the profits of educators rather than the other way around. So this is called the superstar effect, that one individual can reach many people. And that markets may adjust by the superstars becoming even bigger superstars rather than by competition. So in the long term, profits may actually be higher for the people at the top rather than lower. And this means that the distribution of talent is really going to be crucial for a lot of things that we're going to think about in this course. Because this is going to determine the rents, it's going to determine the nature of the long-run adjustment. If the top people are much better than the people just below them, it's going to be much more attractive to allow everyone to access them rather than more people to enter the industry. And note that it's not the entire distribution of talent that matters. It's really only the people at the top. So the reason that it's only the people at the top that matter is that those are the people who are going to be going into the industry, right? People who are sort of mediocre will go do something else. People who are at the very top of the talent distribution will go into that industry. And so the real question is not, is everybody the same? But at the top, are the people relatively similar? Or even at the top, is the best person much better than the next best person? This property is called how big the tails of the distribution are. A distribution is said to be fat-tailed if the people at the top are much better than the next people, and so forth. This is sort of the case when the geniuses are just way above everyone else. So one way to sort of think about a fat-tailed distribution is you've probably known activities in your life that sort of the better you get at them, the more you realize how much worse you are than the real people who are really good at them, right? That's sort of like characteristic of a fat-tailed distribution of talent, right? A thin-tailed distribution is where you feel at some point, well, I kind of mastered that, and that there's all there is to learn. But if you think about something like chess, or most academic learning, or sports, those are things where, like, the better you do, the worse you feel. You know what I mean? Whereas something that's thin-tailed is something like where the better you do, the more you feel you kind of mastered it. And there's lots of skills that are like that in life as well, right? So like driving a car, pretty much, like you learn how to drive a car, and that's basically all there is. You know, I mean, if you were trying to go into like racing cars, you might feel the opposite way, right? But for like just basic driving, it's not like there are people who are like all that much better than anybody else, right? Whereas these fat-tailed things are like, you know, the opposite way around. And it's similar, you know, if you were trying to be the worst depression of all time, you would probably feel similarly, right? Because you'd say like, oh, I'm starting to get to be a pretty bad recession, but then shit, there's the Great Depression, that's much worse, right? So this is what Nassim Taleb calls the black swan. These fat-tailed distributions also tend to characterize what happens in terms of like stock market movements. So stock markets, like, you know, a bad day in the stock market is a lot better than a really bad day in the stock market. And a really bad day is even like a lot more better than like the worst day ever on the stock market. Right? However, a lot of economic theories often rely implicitly on the assumption that there's thin-tailed distributions. And this is common for many statistical distributions. So like uniform distributions, where you can't be above a certain level. A key thing that's being assumed, and a key thing that drives most of the conclusions that you do based on those, is that they have thin tails. That above some level, like there's not anyone much better than that. And normal distributions are similar in that way. So let me see if I've got a picture of these. No, I don't have this for this lecture. Anyway, basically, if you look at a normal distribution, it dies off pretty quickly. If you look at something like a log normal distribution or a Pareto distribution, will look like they just stay very, very sort of high, even as you get way far in the distribution. Yeah, Eric.
Can you draw a fat-tailed and a thin-tailed distribution?
Yeah, let me just switch the other class's slides. Okay, there we go. So here's a uniform distribution. It's big in here, and then it's nothing out there, right? Normal distribution. Big in here, then very quickly dies off. Log normal distribution. Really slowly dies off, right? So you're like way standard deviations above the mean, and it's still like pretty substantial. You see, that's what makes a distribution fat-tailed. Okay, so, unfortunately for anyone who is hoping to make progress in terms of feeling better about themselves as life goes on, most things indicate that in most areas the distribution of talent is extremely fat-tailed. And in fact, it usually follows what's called a power law or a Pareto distribution. And that has the following form. So X is the talent of a given person. X minimum is sort of like where you begin to get this feeling of insecurity. So like that's like the minimum level of talent where it starts looking like a Pareto distribution. And alpha is something which the bigger it is, the less fat-tailed it is. If alpha is small, then it's very fat-tailed. Okay, so some ways to think about this Pareto distribution are the following. The fraction of people that has talent greater than 2x is 1 over 2 to the alpha of the number of the people who have talent above x. So if alpha was equal to 1, so it's very fat-tailed, the people who are like twice as talented there's about half as many people who are at least twice as talented as some level. So you lose about half the people when you double the level of talent. So another way of thinking, if you're thinking about it just in terms of money, that would say that the number of people who are earning above $100,000 is only twice the number of people who are earning above $200,000. Or the people who are earning, $8 million a year is only 1/8 of the number of people who are earning above $1 million a year. That's a very slow rate of dying off in terms of people's talent. So a famous implication of this is that if alpha is 1.2, then 20% of people have 80% of all the talent. Another way of thinking about this is that the fifth most talented person will be 1/5 to the 1/alpha as talented as the most talented person. So if alpha is equal to 1, the fifth person is 1/5 as talented as the first most talented person. The second most talented person is 1/2 as talented as the most talented person. So the further you get up the distribution, the further apart people are. So the first person is twice as good as the second person, but the second person is only 3/2 as good as the third person. And the fourth person is only 4/3, that's right, the third person is only 4/3 as good as the fourth person, and so forth. Many distributions related to talent follow this distribution. So income, for example, is very well known to have a Pareto distribution at the top end of the spectrum, with alpha somewhere between 3/2 and 3. Probably closer to 1.5, especially in the United States, but in some more egalitarian countries, it's closer to 3. Wealth distribution has an alpha somewhere between 1 and 2. CEO compensation is roughly alpha is 3. One of the most common is Zipf's law, which says again that alpha is equal to 1. So the most talented person is 5 times as talented as the fifth most talented person. I'm going to show some pictures of this, but for 2 cases, but it applies in many cases. So comparative advantage across countries. Japan is about twice as good at producing electronics as Korea is. Korea is about 3/2 as productive as, I guess, Taiwan is probably the next country. And then it falls off very rapidly from there. So Japan is just enormously more productive than are other countries at producing electronics. Words in the English language are like this too. The most commonly used word in the English language is used about twice as much as the second most commonly used word. And the second most commonly used word, and it's about 3 times as much as the third most commonly used word. And about 4 times as much as the fourth most commonly used word, and so forth. And this is true in every language, basically. So here is a remarkable graph. So what this is if you just take any given industry, or if you take all companies in the U.S. and you say, how large are they? How many people do they employ? And then you say, how many firms are there of at least that size? You get, and this is pretty darn amazing. I don't know how many of you guys have ever done any empirical economics. You usually get some giant cloud of stuff, and you say, well, is there a line through that? Maybe. And this is like, this is just a line, right? And it just lines up exactly along that. So this is Zipf's law in action, right? So like the biggest firm has twice as many employees as the second biggest, and 3 times as many as the third biggest, and so forth. And here, maybe even more amazing, is cities. So the biggest city in the U.S., New York, is almost exactly twice as big as LA. And is almost exactly 3 times as big in terms of population as Chicago is. and almost exactly 4 times as big as Houston is, which is the 4th biggest city. And so forth down the line. And this graphs that by taking the log of the population against the log of the range. That should be exactly -1, should be its slope, and it should fit perfectly if Zipf's law holds, and it's pretty darn close, right? Okay. So, this raises a lot of questions that we'll be addressing throughout the course. So one is that rents, even in the long run, are going to be very important. If we're in one of these fat-tailed cases, the differences in talent between the top people and the people below them are just so large that in the long run, there's going to be no way for other people to keep up. And the long-run adjustment is probably going to happen by the superstar effect or things like that, rather than by more firms entering the industry. And this fundamentally undermines the logic of free entry that a lot of economics depends on. And you might actually think that this shows that in intellectual property areas, those are some of the few areas where actually talent can't keep you ahead of everyone else, because it's easy to reverse engineer things. So if you want people to go into developing new products rather than into other areas, it's going to be really important that you give them intellectual property protection. Because otherwise, they're going to go somewhere where their talent can actually make the money that it deserves. So in some ways, you could think that IP, rather than making an unnatural barrier to entry, is actually just reconstructing the barriers to entry that exist in other areas. Another problem that this raises is that if some firms are so much better than others and are going to be so much bigger, that's going to probably give them a lot of market power, unless there are really big diseconomies of scale, and therefore there's a very large number of firms. And you'll look at this on your problem set a little bit. And that's going to raise big problems for thinking that there's a competitive industry. It's going to force us to think about industries with a small number of firms. Also, it said that the income distribution is going to be very unequal. And that might give us reason to want to redistribute income or wealth. And it's also going to mean that raising taxes just on the top incomes can generate a lot of money. Because if 20% of people control 80% of all wealth, right, a lot of the money to be gotten can be gotten out of the top part of the income distribution. And so, in some sense, this is the agenda of things we're going to be looking at during the rest of the course. And I can take questions for 10 minutes, or you guys can just speak. Thanks.